Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Woodman, and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to talk about your right to offend. Let's start with the historical background. On April 26, 1968, 19-year-old Paul Robert Cohen entered the Los Angeles County Courthouse. Cohen was there to testify in a misdemeanor trial as a defense witness, but 3 police officers took particular note of what Cohen was wearing. At trial, Cohen testified that the words on the jacket expressed, quote, the death of his feelings against the Vietnam War and the draft, unquote. No one claimed that he or anyone who saw his jacket had attempted any violent action in the core building, quote, nor was there any evidence that he uttered any sound prior to his arrest, unquote. Cohen was convicted of a California law that prohibited, quote, meticulously and willfully disturbing the peace or quiet of any neighborhood or person by offensing conduct, unquote, and sentenced to 30 days in jail. His conviction was affirmed by the California Court of Appeals, which found that Cohen, quote, carefully chose the form for his views where his conduct would have in effect a shock impact and was intent upon attracting the attention of others to his views by the sheer vulgarity of his expression, unquote. The court rejected his First Amendment arguments, asserting that, quote, no one has the right to express his views by means of printing lewd and vulgar language which is likely to cause others to breach the peace to protect women and children from such exposure, unquote. The harsh sentence and the almost palpable disdain towards Cohen can seemingly best be explained by a deeply felt hostility to the language and content of his political message. This judicial reaction to Cohen's slogan also reflected how extremely divided the country was in 1968, both towards the Vietnam War and the student-led anti-war movement that was rising against it. Still, this case would be appealed to the Supreme Court, which was called Cohen v. California. Here's what happened. On February 22, 1971, oral arguments were about to begin, but Chief Justice Warren Burger did not want the explicitive central to the case to be spoken aloud and tried to communicate this to Cohen's attorney, Melville Nimmer. Nimmer, a distinguished professor at UCLA School of Law and a copyright expert, thought he would lose the case if he didn't say the F word out loud. Using in euphemism would be essentially conceding that the word was indeed unspeakable in courtrooms and society. He decided to take a bold stand. He would politely acknowledge the guidance and then just politely ignore it. He said, quote, may it please the court, what this young man did was to walk through a courtroom corridor wearing a jacket upon which were inscribed the words, F the draft. As Nimmer said, unquote. As Nimmer said the word in question, quote, the Chief Justice's face turned a bright crimson, almost matching the deep red curtains behind the bench, unquote. Nimmer had demonstrated that uttering the F word before the justices had neither caused chaos to ensue nor destroy the sanctity of the court. None of the justices, however, would follow his lead and utter the word themselves even once during questioning. Nimmer then tried to get the justices more comfortable with the youth-driven protest movements of the time, which provided the background for Cohen's case. So he cleverly told them they could teach those kids a valuable lesson. The younger generation tends to, quote, equate violent dissent and dissent that may be regarded as objectable or offensive. It is terribly important, Nimmer encouraged, that this court make clear that distinction, that dissent by its very nature involves the right to be offensive, but on the other hand, violent dissent is something quite different, unquote. Nimmer was saying that if Cohen was punished for an indisputably peaceful protest, then that leaves nothing to discourage anyone from turning to violence as they continue to express their anti-war messages. Nimmer also contended that the public deserves to know the, quote, death of the feeling, unquote, that sometimes can most effectively be communicated by cursing. Nimmer talked about how, quote, language performs two functions. There is the emotive content of the language, and there is the intellectual content of the language, and that these intersperse, unquote. Forcing Cohen or any dissenter to express their views without offensive language would rob their speech of its emotive power. Nimmer asserted that the First Amendment was all about, quote, competition in the marketplace of ideas, what ideas are going to prevail, but in order for that system to work, it's important that the state not step in and try to censor the emotive content, because in so doing, the state is thereby enabled to determine what ideas prevail in the competition of the market. And so far, that reason we submit to the court respectfully that offensiveness of form, no less than offensiveness of substance, must be preserved by the First Amendment if the First Amendment is to be meaningful, unquote. Nimmer had ingenuously placed the F word not at the periphery, but at the center of the First Amendment theory, and rarely has the marketplace metaphor been so persuasively wielded. Justice Potter Stewart asked the Los Angeles Deputy City Attorney Michael T. Sawyer to explain that if the California statute prohibited, quote, tumultuous and offensive conduct and not speech, then the conduct was precisely what, unquote. Sawyer said, quote, displaying the sign on the jacket by the fact he was walking with the sign displayed on his jacket, unquote. Stewart followed up to see if walking was an offensive conduct, and Sawyer said walking with the sign is not. Sawyer said Cohen's conduct of displaying the sign where other people were present was offensive. Sawyer seemed not to appreciate that Marshall had gotten him to acknowledge that the state's position boiled down to nothing more than the desire to prohibit the use of a single word. However, he framed the state's position as, at most, an inconsequential intrusion on First Amendment values. He said, quote, words of this type are no essential part of any exposition of ideas and are of such slight social value that any benefit that may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interests in order and morality, unquote. Nimmer succinctively urged the Supreme Court to reverse the conviction by saying, quote, the language of profanity is not outside the scope of the First Amendment simply because it's offensive, unquote. By the next conference, Harlan had made up his mind to reverse the conviction. The vote would be 5-4, and Harlan was assigned to write the decision. Harlan began by sweeping away, quote, what the case is not about, unquote. He swiftly dismisses the idea that California was regulating conduct, writing, quote, the only conduct which the state sought to punish is the fact of communication. Thus, we deal here with a conviction resting solely upon speech, unquote. He goes on to remind everyone that, quote, the state certainly lacks the power to punish Cohen for the underlying content of the message the inscription conveyed about the inutility or immorality of the draft, unquote. He explains that the use of the F word did not fall into any category in which the First Amendment permitted limits on speech. The word is not obscenity because it is not erotic, or fighting words because it was not directed at any person, nor a captive audience problem because it took place in public rather than causing an intrusion in the privacy of the home. Harlan presents the case as being about the state's efforts to, quote, remove this offensive word from the public vocabulary, unquote. Harlan rejected the idea that the use of the word, quote, is inherently likely to cause violent reaction, unquote. Referring to the Tinker case, he stated that, quote, undifferentiated fear or apprehension of disturbance is not enough to overcome the right to freedom of expression, unquote. He also raised the broader notion of whether the government should have a role in, quote, acting as guardians of public morality, unquote. He said, quote, the constitutional right of free speech, free expression is a powerful medicine in a society as diverse and populous as ours. It is designed and intended to remove governmental restraints from the arena of public discussion, putting the decision as to what Views shall be voiced largely into the hands of each of us in the hope that the use of such freedom will ultimately produce a more capable citizenry and more perfect polity, and in the belief that no other approach would comport with the premise of individual dignity and choice upon which our political system rests. To many, the immediate consequences of this freedom may often appear to be only verbal tumult, discord, and even offensive utterance. These are, however, within established limits and truth necessary side effects of the broader enduring values that the process of open debate permits us to achieve. That the air may at times seem filled with verbal cacophony is, in this sense, not a sign of weakness, but of strength. We cannot lose sight of the fact that, in what otherwise might seem a trifling and annoying instance of individual distasteful abuse of a privilege, these fundamental societal values are truly implicated. How is one to distinguish this from any other offensive word? Surely the state has no right to cleanse public debate to the point where it is grammatically palatable to the most squeamish among us, unquote. Harlan recognizes that although the F word may be worse than most curse words, quote, it is nevertheless often true that one man's vulgarity is another's lyric. Words are often chosen as much for their emotiveness as their connotative force, and that emotive function may often be the more important element of the overall message sought to be communicated, unquote. As a result, Harlan insisted the emotive power of cursing must not be criminalized. It would be a facile assumption, Harlan pointed out, quote, that one could forbid particular words without also running a substantial risk of suppressing ideas in the process, unquote. That risk would become even greater if there were no check on government power of particular words as a convenient guise for banning the expression of unpopular views. Essentially, the majority in this Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment prohibited the state from making, quote, the simple public display of this single four-letter expletive a criminal offense, unquote. The decision stands for two crucial free speech principles. One, offensive speech, including but not limited to curse words, is as fully entitled to First Amendment protection as any other speech. Two, just as importantly, in public places, it is the speaker's right to choose the language they feel is most effective to communicate their message. These concepts go hand in hand to create significant free speech rights for protesters, even when they are not speaking at all. It is important to remember that you can wear clothing with political messages or simply express specific political messages, even if those messages are offensive, as long as the messages do not fall into incitement, defamation, or true threats against somebody. Also, remember that the First Amendment rights only protect against government interference with speech and not the actions of private employers. This is what we talked about when we talked about compelled speech. Let's look at a modern example of this. On a Saturday afternoon in October of 2017, a woman named Julie Briskman was riding her bike near her home in Northern Virginia. As about a half dozen vehicles began to slowly drive past her, she realized it was President Trump's motorcade leaving the nearby Trump National Golf Course. She said, quote, "My blood started boiling at that point. I lifted my arm and started flipping him off. I started thinking, you're golfing again when there is so much going on right now," unquote. Afterwards, she did not give it much more thought, never expecting that this fleeting expression of anger was about to change her life. Unbeknownst to the unidentified woman, members of the press corps happened to capture the moment of spontaneous protest. A few hours later, the White House bureau chief of Voice of America tweeted a photograph of the lone cyclist. That Monday, Julie Briskman decided to tell her employer that she was the woman in the now famous photo. One day later, Briskman was fired and escorted out of the building, taking her personal belongings with her in a box. It was only after Briskman lost her job, allegedly for violating the company's social media policy, that she identified herself to the media. 6 months later, she sued her former employer for wrongful termination. However, Julie Briskman's wrongful termination lawsuit was eventually dismissed. Cohen v. California makes it unconstitutional for the government to punish you for giving the middle finger, but the First Amendment offers no protections to private sector employees who express their free speech rights even during personal time and outside of the workplace. Briskman lost her job but received many offers of employment and was soon working again. She ran for a seat on her local county board of supervisors in Loudoun, Virginia. Her opponent was an incumbent Republican who campaigned for Trump. Briskman said, quote, "I've gotten some feedback that folks say you should respect the president. Even if you don't like what they're doing, you shouldn't show this sort of disdain. And I simply disagree. And I think the Constitution grants me that privilege," unquote. Many voters must have felt similarly since Briskman won her race and was elected with more than 52% of the vote. Still, this is important to keep in mind because while you will not go to jail for saying something offensive, private organizations you are associated with might fire you or kick you out of the organization because they might not be okay with your political messaging. Whether that possibility affects your decision to create a specific political message or not is your choice to make, since all of our lives are different. After all, it is easy to know you have the right to say offensive messages, but you also need to be prepared with any reactions you could receive with those political messages. While you can't control how other people will react to your messages, you need to make sure you feel comfortable with saying your messages and having good self-control with not escalating your messages into violence or defamation. In the next video, we will talk about your right to publish without being stopped by the government. Until then, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and turn on the post notifications so you will be notified when I post my next video. I appreciate your support. Remember, you are powerful, you are capable, and you are the changemaker our society needs. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you soon.